Let's round things out by looking at the various execution processes we've seen in the course of this semester. We've been running syrup programs, and how does that work? Well, we have an Intel machine, and on top of that, we've got a syrup interpreter in Intel machine code, and we feed in syrup programs and outcome experiments. But how did we get a syrup interpreter that could run on the Intel machine? The syrup interpreter was written in Haskell and compiled using the Glasgow Haskell compiler, which had already compiled itself into Intel machine code. Told the story of how that traced back to the 1980s and even further than that. So this is compiled from Haskell to C via GHC and then to Intel by a C compiler called Clang. So that's how syrup programs run. Now, we've also been doing exercises involving the tiny machine. Tiny tracing problems require you to be a tiny emulator, but I also have a tiny emulator to check your work. So I have a tiny emulator running on an Intel machine. And we feed in tiny prog plus input, and out comes a tiny trace. Meanwhile, and this I should say, this is a tiny prog in machine code. Meanwhile, for assembly exercises, again running on an Intel machine, I have a tiny assembler, and I can feed in tiny assembly programs, and out comes a pile of hexadecimal tiny machine code. So again, it will not surprise you to learn that I wrote the tiny emulator and the tiny assembler. They were both originally written in Haskell, but by the time they are run, they're in Intel machine code because they've been compiled by the Glasgow Haskell compiler. So let's just have a quick sneak preview of what happens next semester. So next semester, you will be learning about how to make high-level programming languages run. How do high-level programming languages turn into assembly language so that they can run programs for you? What kind of stuff goes into a compiler? Well, we'll be exploring that using two pieces of equipment. On the one hand, we'll be targeting the massive machine. So I have, running on top of an Intel box, I have a massive emulator, and we can feed in massive machine code, and out comes the output from whatever the program was. But that only tells us how to run the thing we come up with. How do we get our hands on the massive machine code? Well, guess what? Running on top of an Intel machine, I have a compiler interpreter. And into the compiler interpreter, you feed an L compiler for any language L that you like, and an L program. So I've got a programming language for writing compilers in. So we can write a compiler for any language we want. We'll be playing with a little programming language called IMP, and then we feed in an IMP program. And the compiler interpreter runs and produces the output of the L compiler, namely the L program in massive machine code, ready to feed in to the massive emulator. So in fact, the compiler interpreter is really running this program on that program, producing massive machine code, which then gets fed into the massive emulator and actually delivers the output at the end. And you can actually step through the massive emulator in slow motion. So the way we get programs to run is by a whole series of processes. I mean, of course, the massive emulator and the compiler interpreter were written in Haskell, compiled with the Glasgow Haskell compiler. So there's a whole system of compilers compiling compilers and interpreters within interpreters that keeps the entire stack of our software construction business going. Welcome to it.